I'm going to have to do that over. All right. So attention, everybody. The views and opinions expressed on the show are not necessarily those of Acts Ministry, Acts Media Group, and or their affiliate subordinate ministries and or nonprofits. So here they are to have a good time. It's that time again. It's the Happy Hour with your host, Dr. Paul Collins, and his lovely wife, Miss Nancy. She keeps him in line. So, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Happy Hour. It's Friday morning again. As I'm fond of saying, comes around this same time every week, right here in Springburg, USA, Ozarks, the land of the beautiful hills and clear running streams and beautiful lakes. It's a great place to live, Nancy.
You know, one of these days, there won't be a Friday, there won't be a Monday or a Tuesday or any day. There'll only be...
day.
Only be day. And
no
the sun will always be shining, and there will be clouds, but there won't be dark.
There'll be no sun because there's no need of the sun there.
No,
for God is the light.
That's right.
That's right. And there's an old song that says, "No more night there."
Yes.
So,
but
anyway.
they'll have clouds, and they won't be black clouds, and you can float right up through them.
Right.
And there's no wrecks or anything like that in heaven.
All right. Well, as I've told a lot of folks, it's not a preaching show, so let's tone it down over there, girl. And I want to say here a greeting to all of our friends that watch us consistently. Shirley, my first secretary in St. Joseph, Missouri. Jerry Chambers, my teenage boy who's now retired school administrator, who was a member of my church in St. Joe. Hello to the other folks in St. Joe area, Joetown it's called, and hello to the folks in Northeast Missouri. A new watcher for the last month or so, Tom Seaver, carrying our messages to the folks at Lakeview Chapel Church, and let's see, people in Moberly. Old Bill Gaines is still hanging out up there, and of course, Carolyn Griffith, or used to be Griffith, Carolyn Jeffries, still hanging out up there. And people in northwest Texas, out in Lubbock area.
Yeah, boy.
The Dr. Terry Gage, M.D., medical doctor, and his wife and family. And then Reverend Mark Elvers and his wife, Deborah, pastors of Salvation Ministries Church. Lyle and Darlene Way. Lyle is a Christian novelist.
And they're all prayed for every day.
That's right. And I have a cough drop in my mouth because my throat was a little foggy. So if you hear some clicking, it's the cough drop. If you hear some whistling, it's because, as I've told you several weeks in a row, I'm waiting for June and the dentist to get my whistle fixed. Anyway, it is the happy hour. And let's see. Greetings to folks in... around the Dallas area. Galen Garrett represents those, and further south in Texas, around College Station, Judy Nickel represents those folks. And then we have people out in up in Indiana, Indianapolis area, and we have people in Illinois. Tammy Renee Harris is over there, and she's a great singer, beautiful lady, and longtime friend. Let's see, where else? We have a lot of friends all over, Nancy. By the way, we lost a friend, but we know where she is. Last Tuesday evening, about 6:45, Jackie Scott Phillips. She went to heaven, young, and it was cancer that took her. She was a committed Christian, dedicated Christian. She was a member of the Acts Ministry Board. In fact, was secretary of the board. And she was very gifted ventriloquist, and I don't know what her little dummy Joy is going to do now without Jackie to manipulate him. Jackie was a precious friend of ours for probably 30 years, and tomorrow morning I will have the honor of speaking at her funeral service in Branson, Missouri, in the church where she was a part of it for so many years, her and her little dummy Joy, entertaining kids. Jackie even went overseas, like South America, Mexico, and places, and took Joy along. And made quite a witness for Jesus every place she went. Our condolences and our prayers to her husband, Randall. Randall is the man who received a kidney transplant because of the efforts of Acts Ministry, and they waited to get married until he was finished with all of his multiple surgeries, and by that time Jackie had cancer of her larynx, and then they got married in November, and Dr. Wining, president of Acts Ministry, gave her away in a church wedding in the Kansas City area where she was living, and she was so weak she couldn't stand up. They had to sit in chairs for the wedding. Very valiant lady, valiant. And I can tell you right now, Nancy and I have been privileged to know some very valiant people. And tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock in Branson at the Glory Barn, I will say some words that I believe Jackie would once said at a memorial service. Anyway, we move along now to other topics, since this is the happy hour. I want to say this about this COVID thing. Folks, I'm hearing stuff from every side, I guess, of that issue. There's still people who don't believe in the COVID virus, and yet I've had 2 really good friends die because of COVID. I've had the man who called me just before we went on the air, young guy in the construction business, owns a big construction company, hard worker. He was very ill with the COVID. He was just telling me that they've had some cases in their church. Every time they try to have services, somebody comes down with the COVID and they have to shut down for a couple of weeks. It's very serious, more serious than some people want to make it out to be. Nancy and I are careful. We have our mask that we wear when we're out in public, and we are taking some a prescription that was recommended by a medical doctor, a friend of ours, Dr. Terry Gage, out in Lubbock, Texas, and we're taking our other supplements and trying to do what we can to not have the COVID and not spread the COVID. Anyway, whatever your point of view is about it, believe it or not, I respect your point of view, but if you're not one that wants to be cooperative with the rest of society in handling this thing, no matter where it originated or what the cause or who's making money off of it or whatever, don't endanger your family, don't endanger your neighbor, don't endanger the stranger in the supermarket. Play along, and let's all work together to get this thing whipped. We had to do that with polio and measles and typhoid and all kinds of things. Let's do it this time. Let's get it done. Now, continuing on, because this is going to have to be the happy hour, I want to deal with a little bit of history. Seems like the folks that watch us kind of like the history that I throw out there. Mm-hmm. I am living now under the 14th, I believe it is, president in my lifetime. Start with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Wow. Now, I'm going to point out some of the problems that are not necessarily well known, what they're remembered for. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt served, he was elected 4 times. He served a little over 3 terms. His 4th term, he just got started and then died. But not much is said about the fact that he had a mistress, which he did, and history has recorded it. But we focus rather on the many good things that he did rather than that one thing. He was succeeded by Harry Truman, and Harry Truman did not have a good business background, and he was from Independence, Missouri. He became what was then known a county judge. Now they're county commissioners. He had the backing of a mob, the crime syndicate, headed up by a man named Pendergast, and became a United States senator. And the next thing you know, he's on the ticket as vice president with Roosevelt. And then Roosevelt dies, and suddenly the man from Missouri becomes president. Best known probably for authorizing the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in World War II. However, he was also well known because he liked to walk, and Secret Service men had to strut right along to keep up with Harry. That was his exercise, walking. And Harry was also well known for his salty language. There's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, that some reporters, since they'd had a time in the Rose Garden at the White House, asked Mrs. Truman, Mrs. Truman, doesn't it kind of bother you a little bit that the president talks about fertilizing the roses, the flowers with manure? And she said, no, it took me a long time to teach him to say manure. So Harry was really quite a guy. We're very proud of the man from Missouri. He started out walking behind a single plow pulled by a mule at Lamar, Missouri. So what a success story. He was succeeded by Dwight David Eisenhower, who had been a 5-star general. And Eisenhower's 8 years as president were years of calm and peace and building interstate highways. That was his big thing. Not talked about very much is that while he was still a general on active duty in Europe, his driver was a female, and apparently there was a little bit of something going on between General Eisenhower and his driver, and but it's not played up in the history books, but it's there. Following Dwight Eisenhower, we had John F. Kennedy and Camelot, and people were fascinated by this young president and his young family, and his brother, who was Attorney General. And history has borne out the fact that there were women involved that he was not married to, and that sort of thing was going on in the White House. And then he was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson, most famously, was known as Landslide Lyndon because they kept counting votes in Texas until finally he won the United States Senate seat by 81 votes or something like that.
Is that like they might say about the past
election?
Election.
Well, this was more so, this was just Texas where he was running for the United States Senate, and they kept counting votes until finally they got him in by the skin of his teeth. They called him Landslide Lyndon, which was being derogatory, of course, facetious. But Lyndon Johnson is the one who, because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, heated up our participation in the Vietnamese conflict, which became the Vietnamese War without declaring war. And at one time we had 500,000 servicemen and women in Vietnam. And it was a tragic event in the history of America, with people here, young men burning their draft cards and going to Canada. It was one of those things that Johnson had on his watch. However, he did push through a phenomenal civil rights bill. Now we move from Johnson to Richard Nixon, who had unsuccessfully tried to win the presidency in 1960 when it was won by John F. Kennedy, again under suspicious circumstances of counting votes in Chicago, etc. Everybody knows that story. To Richard Nixon's credit, in 1960, he said that he wouldn't demand a recount. He would not put the nation through that. And most historians agree that Nixon actually could have succeeded and been the president instead of Kennedy. So we wait a number of years, and Johnson doesn't run for re-election, and Nixon makes another effort at it. He is elected. He's best known probably for Watergate, the scandal concerning that. However, Nixon, it is reported, now I'm like old Will Rogers. I only know what I read in the newspaper or now what I hear on the news or see on internet. Apparently Richard Nixon had, while he was president, a thing going on with a very blonde, beautiful lady in the news world who later became very well known as a national news person. And so that was, it happens. It seems like it happens very often with the United States presidencies. After Nixon, we had Gerald Ford, who was basically inherited the office. He was appointed as vice president, and when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford was underappreciated probably. They thought he was clumsy, and the news media kind of made fun of him that he played football for the University of Wisconsin, not wearing a helmet, that kind of thing. They were unkind toward Gerald Ford. A genuinely good man, and but because he had pardoned Richard Nixon for any possibility of future convictions, made him a sitting target to be defeated by Jimmy Carter, the guy with the big toothy smile who had been the governor of Georgia but was best known for being a peanut farmer. And Jimmy Carter moved into Washington with his Georgia Mafia, it was called, his ringleaders of his advisors and leaders and etc., and basically had a failed presidency because inflation went up to like really high interest rates, like 22% if you could find money to buy a house. It was a mess. And Jimmy Carter was trained as a nuclear engineer and had served on a nuclear submarine as an officer. Anyway, Jimmy Carter, a staunch Southern Baptist who taught Sunday school in a Southern Baptist church, and still does to this day in his 90s. Jimmy Carter, nearest that he came to any kind of a moral lapse that we know anything about wasn't really a moral lapse. It was maybe lack of judgment at the time. He allowed himself to be interviewed by Playboy magazine, I think it was, and but in the course of that interview, he talked about being born again, and all of a sudden he made that phrase more popular than Billy Graham made it popular. So all of a sudden there were all kinds of people getting on what I call the born again bandwagon because President Jimmy Carter said he'd been born again. So Jimmy Carter, still around to this day and still doing good charitable work, etc. Quite a survivor. And let's see, after Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, movie actor in B-grade movies, no big hits, TV host of Death Valley Days, and a former Democrat who became a Republican and worked for Johnson's competitor, Goldwater, and then became governor of California for 2 terms. And he was famous for his wit and the fact that he could get along with just about anybody. The Speaker of the House of Representatives was a Democrat, Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, and he and Ronald Reagan just really became good buddies. But Ronald Reagan did some things that were rather cutesy. One time as governor, he was making his way through a crowd of students, and the students were giving him the silent treatment on purpose. Instead of being raucous, they were like dead silence. And when he got through the group, he turned around and looked at them, put his finger up at his mouth and said, "Shh." And they loved him for it. But biggest thing, nearest thing to a scandal that he had was the Iran-Contra arms deal, and Colonel Oliver North being on the hot seat, being interviewed by senators concerning it. He got off, and Reagan didn't have to pay a political price for the Iran Contra deal where he provided arms to help get people released that the Iranians were holding captive, Americans that were being held captive. Anyway, other than that, his wife, who had a great name, Nancy, she sadly became best known maybe for consulting with a woman who dealt with horoscopes and that kind of stuff, kind of dark side of things. Anyway, after Ronald Reagan, his vice president. Go ahead.
Well, I know, but wasn't Ronald Reagan the one that Mr. Gorbachev?
Oh, tear down. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, Ronald Reagan was very famous for his words at the Berlin Wall. Mm-hmm. Now, you see, Kennedy had said in German something like "Ich bin Berliner." I mean, he thought he was saying, "I too am a Berliner," and turns out that's not what he was saying. He didn't know it, but I've forgotten what it was. But it was kind of funny. Anyway, years later, then Ronald Reagan is there, and even though his speechwriters wouldn't put it in the speech, he said it anyway. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Mm-hmm. And that started the ball rolling. He worked diligently with Pope John Paul II against the Soviet Empire, which he called the Evil Empire. And then he was succeeded by his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush number 1. And he followed through with the kinds of trade sanctions, et cetera, that were going on and the military buildup. It broke the Soviet Union financially, and it broke up so that there was no more Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but instead there was Russia and these other smaller countries that had been a part of the Soviet Union. So between Reagan and Bush, Soviet-style communism was brought to its knees. After George Herbert Walker Bush, we had William Jefferson Clinton, whose real name was William Jefferson Bly. They named Blyville, Arkansas, after his family. He was officially adopted by Clinton, so he took the name Clinton, but he was born William Jefferson Bly. William Jefferson Clinton, Bill Clinton, we all know, had 2 terms as president in spite of being impeached, and of course he was not. You're impeached by the House, but you have to be on trial in the Senate. The Senate didn't find him guilty. Therefore, he continued to serve. He's probably best known for the lady who was a White House intern and the affair that went on in the Oval Office, the little office just beside the little workroom next to the Oval Office, and that sort of thing. A sordid tale, to say the least. And it's too bad that because he did get credit for a soaring economy and that we had no debt in the government, but it was because really of high tech had come on, and he was riding the wave of the strength of a new economy based really on the performance of high tech stocks, that sort of thing. Anyway, you can look it up for yourself. Interesting. Following Bill Clinton, then we have George W. Bush, son of George Herbert Walker Bush. We have George Walker Bush, Bush number 2. No sexual scandals, but a lot of debate about how he involved us in foreign wars. His dad had involved us in the Iraqi military action with a coalition of many nations that he put together, to his credit, and his approval rating, George the First approval rating went up into the 90s. That's unheard of. But because of the economy and because Bill Clinton had some good advisors, he was defeated after 1 term. Now, after 2 terms of Clinton, we have George II, and he involves us in things because of the Twin Towers being destroyed. Everybody knows that story, but
and there's the Pentagon too.
Well, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and then the plane that crashed in the field in Pennsylvania. And of course, we have all kinds of conspiracy theorists out there still talking about how some even theorize that our own government did all that. Well, they can theorize all they want to. The tragic side of it is people lost their lives, and we got engaged in more military action overseas. Following George W. Bush, we have the first man with some African American blood background, Barack Hussein Obama. His father was an African, his mother was an American, and he was a community organizer in Chicago, became a state senator, and then became a United States senator, and very quickly threw his hat in the ring to run for the Democrat nomination for president. He gained the nomination over against Hillary Clinton and others, and went on to win the presidency, the first man of African American heritage to take on the responsibilities of the Oval Office. I'd say history has yet to take a good, strong look at the Obama presidency to determine its value or what was going on and what wasn't going on and that sort of thing. So you have to have enough years past that you can stand back and look. However, he is succeeded after 2 terms by Donald John Trump, our most recent former president, and he has already had his legacy being examined intensely by those who are strongly attracted to him and those who hate him. So, but the book is still out as to how history is really finally going to determine the value or no value, whatever, of his presidency. Now we have a man who served 2 terms as vice president, just as George H.W. Bush did. Now we have Joseph W. Biden Jr. as our president, and we have to wait to see how this is going to turn out. So that's the history of presidents in my lifetime. Now, from the viewpoint of someone like me who has lived beyond 85 years now, I'm heading for number 86, and who grew up in an area that was known as Little Dixie and very, very strongly Democrat. I grew up in an area where Republicans didn't even run for county office, and I grew up in a time when rarely did you see a Republican elected to office in the state of Missouri.
Why was that?
It was the holdover from the days of the strength and power of Franklin Roosevelt and his wife, especially, who was very influential among the unions and people of the black race and people who were very poor, because the Roosevelts really did a job of trying to lift the standard of living and so forth. So yeah, it was very popular. And but you see, prior to that, when the Republican Party first burst on the scene in the 1860s, about 1860, they were extremely popular in the North, and the Democrats controlled all of the South. And Missouri was a border state, but in the middle of Missouri, you had Little Dixie, it was called, which meant very southern, where I grew up, and it was strongly Democrat. So it was the Democrat Party that fought to defend slavery, and they were the Confederacy was primarily the Democrats, whereas the Yankees were primarily the Republicans. So things have flipped and switched and round, and you have to have a program to keep up with what now, as far as I'm concerned, politics is like professional wrestling. It's about as phony as a $3 bill. So anyway, from my eyes, the one who grew up on the wrong side of the tracks in Little Dixie, and my parents had 5th grade education. I'm the only one in my family of 6 children that graduated high school. Those were the kinds of days we had. Back then, if you got an 8th grade education, that was considered sufficient.
It was, here's a neat way of looking at this. Was your town, I'll say, your area, with people being raised how they were raised, almost like all you had was one store, one grocery store. And so you never thought about going anywhere else because you went to that one store and that's the way it was.
Well,
so what I'm getting at is it bothers me big time when people don't start thinking outside themselves and start looking outside themselves and reading and listening and thinking about how they want to think. Then it's like that they didn't change all because of that. They didn't think differently.
Well, your analogy is quite good by today's standards about just having one grocery store. But when I grew up, people walked almost every place they went. And so in my neighborhood, there was a little bitty grocery store about the size of the studio. It was Mr. Warbritton's store, just a block west, half block west. About a block southwest was Rumsey grocery store, and next to it May's grocery, and they were all very small little rooms like this. And this across the street was Miss Brockman's store, and she operated out of one room of her house. What would have been the living room was her store, and then up the street the other direction there was another little grocery store. And because you see, people did a lot of walking those days. Anyway, especially when you consider during World War II, nobody built new automobiles. All machinery was built for the war effort. So automobiles were not plentiful, and tires were not plentiful. You wore out tires, you were done. and it was, if you drove a car ordinary usage, then you would find that a set of tires lasted a year. My first car, every year I'd go to Montgomery Ward and have a new set of Riverside tires put on it. But then something they had experimented with during World War II came along, and now we use them. They're called synthetic tires. There's very little rubber involved. So you get a set of tires now, they last and last and last. Anyway, but I know what you're talking about, people having a choice. I know some people who grew up Republican and they can't think any other way. I know some people who grew up Democrat and they can't think any other way. They don't realize that the Republican Party has changed and the Democrat Party has changed.
Okay, this is like apples and oranges, but to me it's not. Oh, this is so big. You just talked about.
We got 8 minutes.
Yeah, you talk about that's all they had. So nobody was thinking a different thought. Well, you go to church and maybe that's all they know. That person knows that's behind the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
But people aren't thinking about, okay, isn't there something different? Isn't there a God that's bigger than my neighborhood or my state or this country?
Mm-hmm.
People don't think that way, and He is the first and only help. Maybe
we'll put it this way, Nancy. Most people don't think that way. Most people are zeroed in on their party that they grew up with, and most people are zeroed in on the church that they were connected with, their denomination or their no denomination. Or, in other words, for the most part, once a Baptist, you're always going to have some Baptist in you. If you were a Methodist, you're always going to have some Methodist. If you were Pentecostal, forever a Pentecostal. People are not reading and studying and digging in like I would like for them to. I think everybody ought to do like I do, read a lot. I think everybody ought to look at all the news networks and get all the news also by the internet and read a lot of books. That's just not the way the world works. We are down to about 6 minutes here, Nancy, and I know that our audience gets what you're saying. I get it. The real world is this. If we have a sense that big government is working for us, even without identifying it as such, then we say more. We want more. If we think big government is working against us, then we say less, less, less. I try to stand back through these 85-year-old eyes that went to college, went to seminary, earned a doctor's degree, served on school boards, served with mental health institutions on their boards and all kinds of community things, belonged to a lot of different civic clubs. I was a Rotarian, I was a Lion, I was a Kiwanian, I was Oddfellows, all that kind of stuff. And now to look at life as it is now. And I can tell you, in my opinion, we have allowed government to get too large. It gets large because you elect someone to office, they have a staff, and then they increase the size of the staff, and they take on more and more issues touching more and more areas of life, to the point where right now very few people are concerned about how much their congressman or congresswoman is paid. What is their salary? Well, look it up online. It's there. Their base salary is something over $147,000 a year. Then they get all these other perks and benefits. Do you know their retirement? Right now, the average retirement for a congressman is over $80,000, but some of them are retired on as much as like $350,000 or $360,000 a year. That's a pretty good retirement. Their medical care, there's no question about their medical care. We've allowed this, in my mind, to get out of hand, and we're a long ways from the part-time legislators. We've got 4 minutes.
I know, but here again, people aren't thinking, and they're not looking at all. They're satisfied with everything, so they're not questioning at all. They're not getting out there in their thoughts or anything about a whole bunch of stuff. So therefore, all this, I'll say, crud and corruption comes in, and it's like, well, how did that happen? Well, it happens when every person that's able to do something like vote does it.
I'm convinced that we've allowed things to get beyond our control. Control equals power, power equals control, and money is in the mix.
That's
I'm going
right.
to be writing about this, by the way. My website is drpaulcollins.com. Be glad to have you check in on it from time to time, and that's another way you can contact me through that website if you want to send me an email. But anyway, we've allowed government to spiral beyond our control, and I'm convinced, first of all, if you have a congressman that you cannot talk to on the telephone, then you don't really have a congressman representing you. Now, there's going to be people who say, well, that's impossible because he represents so many thousands of people. He has a staff. If you need to be able to talk to your congressman. The last time we had an opportunity for our congressman to get up close to Acts ministry people was a year and a half ago at a banquet. And he made reservations, his office made reservations for him to be there. He didn't show. When I see him sometime at some function, in spite of the COVID virus, I'm going to let him know that he missed a real opportunity there to deal with real people, the people who voted for him. If you have a pastor that you cannot call on the phone, you don't really have a pastor. And I had 2 very real phone calls yesterday because they know how to reach me. I've had a call while I've been sitting here. I wasn't able to take it because of being on the air. If you have a pastor and you cannot call his personal number, you don't really have a pastor. You're going to a church where you have a hired speaker, and there's a difference between a hired speaker and a pastor. A pastor is supposed to be a shepherd, and Jesus described them this way. He said, the good shepherd guards the sheepfold. In other words, he'll lay down in front of the opening of the corral, and anything that's going to come in to bother the lambs and the sheep have to get past him. So now we're down to 1 minute, Nancy, 1 minute, and I wish we had 4 hours. I could do like Rush. I could do 3 hours like Rush Limbaugh, like he did before he came down with cancer. Bless his heart. Rush Limbaugh has a lot of fans, and well, we're out of time, Nancy. We're out of time. We sure enough want you to stay blessed and be with us next Friday, okay? See you then.